All right, Mr. Waldman here. We're going to talk about the synapse today. And the synapse is a really interesting place in the brain. Lots of stuff happens at the synapse. And a large amount of research is occurring here. And so the area that we're talking about here is the end of the axon terminal buttons. If you can see where I'm kind of circling with the mouse, and the receiving dendrites of the receiving neuron. So we're talking about this space right here. It's on this little tiny box that's kind of blown up over here for us. So this is the sending neuron and the axon terminal button, and what these dots represent is the neurotransmitters, or the brain chemicals that get released when an action potential takes place. On this side is the receiving neuron. Okay, the receiving neuron, the receptor sites, they accept the neurotransmitters. Sometimes, if they are designed to accept that particular neurotransmitter, and there's a couple other things that can take place here. The neurotransmitter can be broken down in this gap, and it can also be kind of reabsorbed back into the sending neuron. So let's learn a little bit more about this, because what happens here is vital. So the neurotransmitters are released, and they bind on the receiving neuron. And if we look on the next slide, is what happens during reuptake, meaning that the neurotransmitter gets reabsorbed back into the sending neuron. And if you or anyone else you know is on an antidepressant, that antidepressant most likely blocks this particular process from happening. It blocks reuptake. They are, as a classification of drugs, are called reuptake inhibitors. So if you're inhibiting reuptake, essentially you're increasing the ability of this neurotransmitter to work on the receiving neuron. All right, so how are these neurotransmitters, how do they influence us? This is a huge area of study. This is a huge area of study in the area of psychology and brain science, neuroscience. One of those ways, or one of those neurotransmitters, is serotonin. Increases in serotonin increase mood. So antidepressants do this. And they're involved with mood regulation. And these pathways in here are specific to emotion. Okay, we'll talk about that more later in the course. And another neurotransmitter that is studied is dopamine. And depending on whether you have too much dopamine or maybe too little dopamine, so too much dopamine is tied to schizophrenia, too little dopamine is tied to Parkinson's disease, and these pathways is where dopamine is found in large amounts. All right, so here's a chart in your book, neurotransmitters. These are common neurotransmitters that probably are good to know. We have acetylcholine, okay, and dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, and glutamate. Okay, so these each have their own separate functions, what they do. Acetylcholine enables muscle action, learning, and memory. Particularly, if we take a look at muscle action, for example, if acetylcholine is prevented from transmitting the message to our muscles, we become paralyzed and potentially can die. I've already talked about dopamine and serotonin, and norepinephrine is sort of like the brain's kind of where it gets arousal and energy and it can also influence mood. So some neurotransmitters might increase norepinephrine as well. Lack of GABA, it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Okay, means that once it's released, it's less likely the next neuron is going to fire. Too little of GABA might lead to seizures and the inability to fall asleep. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and this is involved in memory, but memory in many ways is tied to emotion. So you just think about how our memories are tied to extremely emotional experiences, and but too much of this stuff, we're seeing this in migraines and seizures as well. If glutamate is found in MSG, some of you might have to avoid certain types of potato chips, particularly I think barbecue chips. Chinese food that has MSG in can cause headaches. All right, so how does this binding of the neurotransmitter work? Well, it's sort of like a lock and key. Okay, so when you put a lock or a key into a lock of a door, it fits exactly. And that's what we see here. Here's the neurotransmitter. So this is dopamine, serotonin, GABA, whatever. This is the receiving neuron. And you'll notice that they fit exactly. All right, so that's going to either have an inhibitory or an excitatory effect on the receiving neuron. All right, now, sometimes we can introduce drugs, for example, that mimic a neurotransmitter. Okay, so we introduce drugs that are able to get to the brain, and they act as if they are a neurotransmitter. Okay, and ones that excite the neurons in these brain areas are called agonists. Okay, so an agonist mimics the neurotransmitter, and an agonist is going to increase the likelihood of stimulating the receptors of that neurotransmitter it's mimicking. Okay, so for example, our brain produces a neurotransmitter called an endorphin. We release that when our body is in pain, for example. A very similar in chemical makeup is morphine. So when morphine is introduced, it also has the same effect as the endorphins and minimize the pain. Okay, heroin the same way. We'll talk about heroin addiction at some point. Antagonists block the action of the neurotransmitter. So it takes up the space of the receptor. It doesn't allow the neurotransmitter to get into the receptor site, but it doesn't have any effect on it. All right, so this is how, if you block ACH or acetylcholine receptor cells, then the acetylcholine won't be able to get in there to help move muscles. That's how paralysis might happen as a result of sometimes maybe some sort of venom that gets introduced into the body. Okay, and that's it for the synapse. And we'll talk about broader nervous system organization in class, or you'll read it in your book.